My name is Professor Heiko Balster. I'm Director of the Institute for Environmental Futures, and I would like to welcome you all in the room and also the online audience around the world who are joining us today to the hybrid seminar. But it is my great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker for today, Professor Ilan Kelman from University College London. He's Professor for Disasters and Human Health. And he will entertain us with a talk on climate change, which is very, very topical, of course, given that the COP27 climate conference is running at the moment in Sharm el-Sheikh. And at that conference, world leaders are going to take some really important decisions about the way we are going to go forward with the future of our planet and with the future of mankind. So I really look forward to your talk, Ilan. Just to give a bit more background about our speaker today. His research interests are linking disasters and health and integrating climate change into that. He has also worked on island communities and on risk education. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. As was mentioned, the COP is going on, and we are talking about climate change. In fact, the title of the session is Climate Everything: How the Climate Crisis Narrative Undermines Science and Solutions. But it's not just about this seminar. We have to be thinking about this in the long term. We are dealing with the future of humanity and the future of the planet. And the COPs know this. They've already started planning COP28. There was actually recently an announcement about COP31. I'm wondering if anyone in the room wants to make a bid for COP 472. This has been going on for a while. And we would hope that since it has been going on for a while, we might really be focusing on solutions, and preferably evidence-based solutions from the science. So we will continue the discussions. Please do find me on social media. I'm on there, connect, talk about what we're going to mention today, ask questions, because it should not be about today. It should be about all our work over the coming days, and then well beyond COP27 to the coming years and decades. Starting with the baseline. And there are three premises on which I approach this topic. Number one, the climate is changing, and we are significantly contributing to it. Number two, there are major implications from human-caused climate change. They are rapid and they are substantive. We must deal with them urgently. Number three, not everything is climate change. Yet climate change seems to take over our agendas, and in a dramatic fashion. This is a major concern, helping neither science nor solutions. So yes, we are changing the climate. We are doing it quickly, we are doing it to a large degree, and it is a concern that we have to address. But we do have to put it in context as emerges from the starting point, as emerges from the basics. So when we look out the window and it's raining or it's sunny or there's snow, that's weather. Climate, by definition, is average weather. Basically, take something like air temperature or rainfall or wind speed over decades, average it, and that's climate. Climate change, quite logically, is a change in the climate, and it does happen naturally. And climate change is really those weather statistics changing over the long term with natural influences as well as the human influences. The natural influences are intriguing because we can go back to, for example, the Eocene epoch, which was about 53 to 49 million years ago, where atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations were 4 to 6 times the value today. And mean global temperature was 10 to 18 degrees Celsius warmer than in the late 19th century. So are we really concerned about a couple of degrees here and there, or a couple of dozen ppm CO2, or even CO2 equivalent here and there? Well, of course we're concerned, because in the Eocene epoch, we weren't here. And we cannot deal with atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations 4 to 6 times the value today, nor can we deal with a global mean temperature 10 to 18 degrees warmer than in the late 19th century. In fact, we could not deal with ice ages, which have brought ice sheets over 1 kilometer high to mid-latitudes. And with that amount of water frozen on the planet, sea levels ended up 120 meters below the level today. We are not actually changing the climate anywhere near where it has changed in the past. That does not justify us doing it, and we are not ready for the changes that we are bringing, which means that it's actually about us, not about the climate per se. So why do we have these climate phrases dominating our conversations? Why is it climate everything, such as the populist phrases climate breakdown, climate chaos, climate collapse, climate disruption? Some of them have then now become really popular parlance. So even considering the headlines for COP, for example, when it opened, what we ended up seeing was a headline, the main headline in the BBC, quoting people saying, COP27 is now coming. And so what we need to be aware of is the climate chaos warning. Again, how constructive is this? Is this really helpful? Is it in fact climate chaos, or these other phrases, climate breakdown, climate collapse, climate disruption? Well, let's go back to the basics. Climate, by definition, as I said, is average weather over decades. Average weather. It's a purely statistical construct. In fact, climate and weather are not differentiated in many languages. As such, a statistical construct cannot really collapse. It cannot really break down. It cannot really be disrupted. It's simply calculation. We do the measurements of weather. We do a calculation. We get climate. So in languages and cultures where the statistical construction of climate is accepted, it always exists. It doesn't break. It doesn't get destroyed. It doesn't become non-functional. It's just there. It's a number. This means, though, this is exciting. Given that it is a statistical construct, we can test it for mathematical properties. And one mathematical property of a time series is chaos, with very clear, strict definitions, some of which are debated, but this has been going on for a while in terms of the mathematics. And when we do the calculations on climate data, we find, in fact, climate exhibits mathematically chaotic properties. So climate chaos is the norm. It's not a new, strange, or worrisome observation. With an ever-evolving trajectory displaying significant uncertainties and unknowns, it is chaotic. And so it's not really clear how climate could be disrupted or collapse or break from or break down into. Now, this, of course, is a mathematical definition. It's different from common usage. But the whole point is that common usage can undermine science. So this is one illustration of the extent where the basic phrases simply do not match with the science. Again, though, it's all abstract. Who really does these calculations of chaotic time series or climate chaos? What's something more tangible, something more practical? And this is where we see it everywhere. Climate refugee, or climate change refugee, or environmental refugee. Well, let's go to the basics. Let's define. We know what the definition of climate is. We know what the definition of climate change is. What is the definition of refugee? And being practical, there is an international law definition of refugee coming from the 1951 and 1967 Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees by UNHCR, United Nations Refugees. And that definition is someone who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and they're outside their country of nationality and they're not able to return because of a fear, or are unwilling to return because of that fear. So this is definitional. And we notice it in all these words: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Nothing relates to the environment. So by definition, climate refugee, climate change refugee, environmental refugee cannot exist. Well, that's fine. All we have to do is change the definition of refugee. And there's no doubt there are many countries out there which would be delighted to reopen the Convention and Protocol and insert climate or climate change or wider environmental issues to define refugee. Oh, but you know what? since we're actually changing the definition of refugee, let's just tweak it a bit. Why don't we remove religion? And in fact, since we're changing a few things, why don't we remove race from this definition, or even nationality? And you know what? I don't really like that phrase membership of a particular social group or even political opinion. So why don't we just, dilute it a bit so that we accept climate change and environment, but there are others who we may not really want to be refugees. Of course, there's countries going to do that, which means we can end up doing more harm than good, trying to change legal definitions, which have been around for so long. And being around for so long is a challenge. We are very much entrapped by these archaic, top-down, very culturally biased international institutions, organizations, and definitions, such as COP, for example, which really undermine our efforts to try to recognize that science has moved on since 1951 and 1967. Science has even moved on since COP1. And yet still, we have to use these, we're stuck with them, and it leads to problems such as really not being able to define a refugee based on climate change, or the environment. Well, that's fine. Okay, let's not talk about refugees. Let's talk about displacement or migration. So climate migrants or climate change migrants. Well, look, climate migrants, of course we have climate migrants. It's the British people who've bought second homes or retirement homes on the Spanish or French Riviera. But we don't call them climate migrants. We call them expats. And many people throughout human history have moved because the climate changed and things got worse, or they felt there would be better climates elsewhere. So yes, climate change migration happens. Climate migration happens. It's happened for a long time. It's not anything new. It's not any different. The question is actually, is human-caused climate change leading to migration? And so far, despite a lot of rhetoric, despite a lot of headlines, we have looked at all the examples listed, and we cannot say directly that human-caused climate change is the only or main driver of people who are choosing or feel forced to migrate. There are definitely scenarios where this could happen, and those scenarios are not too far off. But when we hear numbers like 1 billion climate refugees, or 200 million climate migrants, or 10 million by 2021 or 2025, those numbers tend to be unverifiable, unprovable, and really just full of rhetoric. Focusing on these migration narratives is simply not supported by the science, and means that for people who really are refugees or asylum seekers, for people who really are forced to migrate for environmental reasons such as building dams and flooding villages, they end up denigrated. And we end up saying, oh, we're going to be inundated by climate change refugees. This is terrible, which then actually feeds into the xenophobia and the so-called refugee crisis, or what was recently by a cabinet minister in the UK called an invasion. So what do we do about it? I mean, what are some of these other phrases? And we hear climate proofing, which again, doesn't make sense because any location sits within a climate. So making a place proof against climate would mean entirely avoiding its environment. It's not what we want. Conversely, the phrase living with climate has been a tenet of sustainability from its origins, including the early days of investigating human-caused climate change back to the 1970s. Living with climate, rather than being proof against climate or climate smart technology, climate smart agriculture, climate smart buildings. Well, is it aimed to differentiate climate smart from climate dumb? Or should we be focusing on people in order to have interventions suitable for everyone, whether the person is smart or dumb, including with respect to weather, climate, natural climate change, and human-caused climate change? We should focus on people. The issue is us. If we instead focus on the environment, then that actually contradicts our knowledge of how to best implement technology and technical approaches to understand the societal impacts, while also recognizing that we do not want to succumb to technological determinism. So climate proofing, climate smart, is really undermining solutions. It's not basing it on the best knowledge we have available, and it's approaching it backwards in terms of what we actually want to see happening. And yet, people then say, well, we have to deal with issues which are about loss and damage from climate change. But loss and damage attribution, particularly to human-caused climate change, is as hard as attributing migration to human-caused climate change. And it really distracts from other ongoing concerns, some of which are unfolded with human-caused climate change, some of which are not. Haiti. It was a colonial and neo-colonial mess for centuries, until finally, after 2004, the world attempted to instill a modicum of governance for the Haitians. Note the language. Maybe it wasn't instilling, maybe it was imposing, because there was a UN mandate. And in the years after 2004, the country prepared detailed policies on addressing climate change. In December 2009, actually set up a climate change division within its environment ministry. A laudable effort and no objection to it. Were there detailed policies on addressing seismic safety? Was there an earthquake division within the environment ministry? Because that earthquake on 12th January 2010 shattered the country, undermining all efforts from governance to climate change. Had real seismic safety started in Haiti in 2004, well, the outcome of 2010 might not have been that much different. It really takes a generation, if not more, for people to deal with earthquakes, for building codes and planning regulations to have that tangible positive impact, which is actually similar to climate change. So rather than separating these issues, rather than separating these varied environmental influences, connect them. Rebuild a country and a people to deal with all the difficulties together, not separating them. And yet 12 years after that earthquake, the lessons have still not been learned. Jamaica is awaiting an earthquake as devastating as Haiti. Jamaica is at the forefront of climate everything. Where is the earthquake issues for Jamaica? Who is dealing with those? Having Jamaica at the forefront of climate everything is undermining solutions. Sticking with the Caribbean, Dominica made headlines when it passed legislation after Hurricane Maria to become the world's first climate resilient nation. Interestingly, the preamble of the law refers to, quote, a climate resilient nation, which is better able to withstand future hurricanes, earthquakes, and others. Well, actually good for them, mentioning many hazards. It is inexplicable why they have now legislated that all hazards are a climate concern, and they could instead have aimed to become the first resilient nation, thereby incorporating climate resilience and earthquake resilience, among many others. It doesn't adopt science. It doesn't support solutions. The COPs are notorious for approaching for supporting this attitude and for approaching these issues in this way. In 2009, there was a suggestion of $100 billion a year going from the so-called richer nations to the so-called poor nations to deal with climate change. Hasn't happened yet, even though it's 2022. And even if it did happen, $100 billion a year, well, okay, that's more than my salary, but it's still not that much money compared to other sources. Direct fossil fuel subsidies from governments to companies generally exceeds over $400 billion a year. If we look at indirect subsidies, it may be 10 times that amount. And some of these subsidies are coming from the poorer countries, including those who want a share of the 100 billion. So wait a minute, let's do this calculation. 400 billion per year directly to cause climate change, 100 billion per year in order to help deal with climate change. Doesn't really add up. All we have to do is stop subsidizing fossil fuel companies. And then the countries asking for the 100 billion will have far more money than they wanted. And in fact, they will stop contributing to the problem because they won't be giving fossil fuel companies. Again, the whole COP notion, the whole $100 billion a year promise is a distraction from the fundamental issue of why we are subsidizing fossil fuel companies to create human-caused climate change. This sort of language permeates so much. One UN agency said that they will be actively participating in the COP27 to highlight the value of investing in expanding early warning coverage as an element of a larger campaign to create a world with zero climate disasters by the year 2030. Climate disasters, climate everything. But disasters are not about climate, it's about the people. This is a premise of the no natural disasters scientific and advocacy viewpoint, which goes back to at least 1976. Disasters come from vulnerability, not from hazard. Climate is average weather, weather is hazard, therefore by definition, weather does not cause disasters, climate does not cause disasters, climate change does not cause disasters. Why zero climate disasters as opposed to just zero disasters? Well, with human-caused climate change, there are actually some exceptions. And heat humidity, which is directly attributable to human-caused climate change, is leading to very high temperatures and directly calculable mortality, which we can attribute directly to human-caused climate change. So I've actually come up with a list of the exceptions where we can say the disaster came from human-caused climate change. Most are in the future, it may be a decade, it may be a century, but heat humidity is killing us now. This is terrifying. This is dangerous. It is an exception to the rule that climate change does not cause disasters, but it is a big exception. So again, it's straightforward. Let's not exaggerate, but let's not deny these disaster-related impacts of human-caused climate change. Let's take the evidence basis for solutions that deal with all issues. And yet, we still see significant attribution of weather situations to climate change. And going back simply 1 year to COP26, we find that there was a headline in the BBC about storm disruption holding up COP26 travelers from London. And so they quoted a climate scientist who was stuck on a train for more than 3 hours because the storm delayed it. And said, this is inconvenient. It's a reminder that climate change drives extreme weather events. Another passenger took a flight because they had to get off their train. So they flew from London to Glasgow. Now, for those of you who take the train regularly in the UK, there's a technical term for weather disrupting and delaying trains. That technical term is business as usual. We can go back to the whole joke about the wrong kind of snow on the line delaying trains, even to the extent that leaves on the track continue to delay trains in the UK. And here we see chaos again, but yeah, okay, that was perhaps travel chaos in the sense that trains were disrupted and delayed. So why do we have news sources trying to claim a storm happened, therefore it was climate change? Oh, and isn't it so ironic that climate change scientists were delayed in going to a climate change meeting? No, just get your public transport in order, get your train service in order, or accept that we are going to have disruptions. You certainly don't want to be taking off or landing in a thunderstorm, so we get delayed. And that really is business as usual. Not a big issue unless we expect everything to be on time all the time and to simply ignore weather, even though weather happens. It's the same climate everything with a certain type of disaster of conflict and wars, because it assumes that climate change will lead to us killing each other. Yet we don't wake up in the morning and say, ooh, the thermometer today is saying 38 degrees Celsius. Yesterday it was 34, therefore I'm going to start a war. No, of course that doesn't happen. As with resources, people make decisions. And we can find examples of people making decisions over resource conflict. There are examples of resource abundance leading to peace and leading to conflict. There are examples of resource scarcity leading to peace and leading to conflict. For conflict and peace, from resources or environmental change. It is factors other than the environment which are inevitably involved, just like migration. And these factors come from people, not the climate, not how the climate is changing. People make decisions. This has been shown for the populist climate conflicts like Syria and like Darfur, yet we still see this myth being repeated again and again and again, that those were climate wars. All you have to do is a search on disaster diplomacy. Go to disasterdiplomacy.org. It's a whole field where we are trying to link environmental change as a causation of peace and conflict, and we are failing to link environmental change as a cause of peace and conflict, because people make decisions to fight or to not. Much of this exaggeration is seen even further in phrases related to islands. So islands are drowning, or islands are sinking. There was one phrase, in fact, from the climate minister of Tuvalu, who said his country was literally sinking. Well, no, if we're saying literally and we want to be pedantic, which we never are as academics, the sea is rising, that doesn't mean the land is sinking. So metaphorically, sure, maybe it's poetic, but it's certainly not literally sinking. Or the head of a very well-known NGO posted on LinkedIn recently, when will wealthy countries accept responsibility for the climate crisis which they created? The huge appetite for fossil fuels means that small island countries like Vanuatu are drowning as sea levels rise. Fact check, Vanuatu's highest point, 1,879 meters above sea level. This doesn't mean people can remain in their coastal villages. It doesn't mean that they can easily move upslope. It does mean that to say that Vanuatu is drowning is factually wrong. Even poor little Bangladesh, little being over 165 million people, even poor little Bangladesh, highest point is 986 meters above sea level. So countries entirely disappearing? Well, it depends. Tuvalu, highest point 4.6 meters, Maldives, highest point 5.1 meters, Marshall Islands, highest point 10 meters. Yeah, there are possible scenarios where a couple of countries disappear, but as head of an internationally renowned NGO, don't talk about Vanuatu drowning. What's even more ironic is, again, thinking more widely. When we look at Tuvalu or Maldives or Marshall Islands, it's far more likely that a tsunami will roll over them and knock out most infrastructure long before sea level rise linked to climate change might cause those problems. Although we saw it already. The 26 December 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami basically inundated all of Maldives. It's happened. And same with Bangladesh. Dhaka will very likely be flattened by an earthquake long before sea level rise causes major problems. So this climate everything approach is simply not scientific. It's undermining what we're trying to do by convincing policymakers to be evidence-based. Instead, people are just making things up and posting it prominently on social media, which interferes with solutions. So we now see people saying, well, it's climate everything. Climate change is going to destroy us. Climate change is going to wipe out humanity. Well, there are some hazard scenarios which are existential threats for humanity. I can't find any link to climate change. This hyperbole then creates eco-anxiety. Climate grief, the technical term being solastalgia. But this doom is not scientifically supportable. It really stops us saying, well, how can we get inspired? What about climate hope? What about eco-inspiration? What about saying there's positive action rather than having doom and gloom? Because you know what? If we're all dead, I might as well just go shopping to New York every weekend. I mean, what's the point? I might as well accelerate the bad change rather than trying to solve it. Whereas I prefer to provide evidence and to try to solve it. So all of these doomerist aspects not only ignore the science about the real impacts from human-caused climate change, of course, one of which is the devastating heat and humidity, but it says, why even bother? And the answer of why even bother is because there is so much eco-hope. There is so much eco-inspiration. All we have to do is look at how well society has done over the last 100 years in terms of advancing social causes. For those who are going after social justice, look at who could vote 100 years ago. Look at who could go to school or university 100 years ago compared to today. Now, we don't have another 100 years. We need to accelerate the pace of change. But let's consider what we do have. We have transition towns. We have movements to reduce energy use, particularly eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, and all the divestment from fossil fuels to try to undermine their financial base and force them into more environmentally friendly and human-friendly approaches. What about all of the local gardening, people growing fruit and vegetables in their gardens, or the guerrilla gardening, taking over abandoned plots of land and using it for local approaches? The fact that we have hordes of designers and planners, engineers and architects looking at how we can do much better with respect to our building design and our community design in order to reduce the energy we use, in order to reduce the vulnerability to weather, in order to reduce all the challenges that far too many people face day to day, which may be crime, maybe assault, maybe precarious housing, maybe precarious livelihoods. We have a long way to go. Nothing is perfect. But look at what we do have. Look at how far we have come. Look at all the pollutants which used to exist, but which we've cleaned up. And recognize that if we don't even try for more, we are dooming ourselves through that decision. It really is ultimately the choice of those who have the power, opportunities, and resources. And by virtue of being here, that's a lot of us. Certainly, we don't have as much power, resources, or opportunities as fossil fuel companies. We can stand here and call out that level of subsidies and try to do better. Because if we don't connect, if we focus on only climate change, or if we give up because of climate change, then we're just creating that ever-descending spiral. And we end up with half-hearted attempts at poor solutions. A generation ago, the watchword in the EU and the US was use diesel vehicles. It's good for dealing with climate change, and it's going to help us. Well, now we know that depending how it's designed, diesel vehicles are not really any better or worse with regards to air pollution or with regards to climate change than other fossil fuel driven vehicles. In many places, actually, for air pollution, diesel vehicles are worse. So everyone who decided to be environmentally friendly by switching to diesel vehicles a generation ago now has to switch to something else, which means we have all this waste from diesel vehicles. So we should not ignore human-caused climate change. We cannot focus on climate everything because we end up with very poor, very dangerous solutions. Instead, it's about connecting, it's about linking, it's about saying, in fact, what we can do is ensure that climate change connects to all other topics. So when we're talking about dealing with climate change impacts, there's nothing different from dealing with wider hazard-related, disaster-related impacts. When we talk about reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, well, we have to reduce all pollutants. So connect, enfold, and recognize that dealing with just one of those in isolation has a potential for causing further problems. So let's ensure that we connect it to all these wider buzzwords we hear: sustainability, development, and health. What's particularly interesting, though, is for both dealing with impacts from climate change and stopping climate change from happening, all the solutions are convincing without invoking climate change. Obviously, we don't want disasters, so deal with weather, deal with environmental change. We don't need to talk about climate change or human-caused climate change per se. We just need to say, we don't want people dying in heat and humidity. We don't want people dying in floods, and we know how to stop it. And it's the same with greenhouse gas emissions. There are two main categories of dealing with climate change. Number one is stop using fossil fuels. There are many reasons for not using fossil fuels. Number one, given the subsidies, they're actually really expensive. Number two is they don't smell so good. That's the air pollution issue. They aggravate cardiovascular issues, breathing difficulties through air pollution. And number three is we know they're a finite resource. Maybe they'll last 50 years, maybe they'll last 500 years. It doesn't matter. We still have to wean ourselves off them. So 3 reasons to get rid of fossil fuels. They're expensive, they stink, and they're finite, and we don't have to invoke climate change. And the other main category of stopping climate change happening is actually absorption of greenhouse gases, which is best done through restoring ecosystems, preferably natural rather than introducing invasive species. But restoring ecosystems helps us with our food, helps us with our water, helps us with our physical well-being, helps us with our psychological well-being. So there's clear reasons to restore natural ecosystems in such a way that they absorb greenhouse gases without even talking about absorbing greenhouse gases. We do not need to invoke climate change in order to solve the identified problems and the impacts. Focusing on climate everything, the climate crisis, climate emergency, climate calamity, climate catastrophe, misses these points, obscures them, and distracts us. Fundamentally, as I alluded to at the beginning, it's not the climate, it's us. Give the planet 1 million years, it won't notice that we've been here. Other pollutants, like persistent organic pollutants and plastics, which are absolutely horrendous. Ironically, plastics coming from fossil fuels. Again, give the planet 1 million years, it won't notice it. They existed. Well, we don't have 1 million years, that's not our lifetime. The issue is us. So we need to admit the real issues and tackle them on that basis, particularly that human-caused climate change is one symptom amongst many, not a specific cause, one symptom amongst many of the human values, attitudes, behaviors, and actions which lead to overexploiting the environment and ourselves. Human-caused climate change is indeed a horrendous example of humanity's millennial-scale history of destroying what we can for short-term profit. And we see that every day now. Human trafficking, human slavery, overfishing, forestry devastation, as I mentioned, plastics and microplastics, nanoparticles, persistent organic pollutants. And if we solved human-caused climate change, let's say overnight we solved human-caused climate change, all these issues would still remain ruining us. Conversely, if we solved all these other concerns, by definition, we stop human-caused climate change. We've dealt with it. So the crisis is not about the climate. The crisis is about us. Or more to the point, the crisis is that we have the solutions to help ourselves. We have the resources to do it, but those solutions are being blocked. Those solutions are being diverted from. Those solutions are being undermined. And sometimes the blocking, the diversion, and the undermining comes from our focus on climate change. Never, ever deny that we are changing the climate rapidly and substantively with huge impacts. Never, ever deny the need for urgent action. But never, ever get tunnel vision on climate change, think that climate change leads to everything, or that climate change is the fundamental cause of all the social ills which as a society we are causing. Instead, look to the exciting examples of hope, exciting examples of inspiration, of seeing what we can do, of seeing all the money and resources and knowledge and power and wisdom we do have available in order to do better for ourselves now and long into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. We have time for questions and comments on your thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much for giving us your thoughts. I would like to ask people in the room, first of all, whether anybody has any questions to our guest speaker today, or whether you have any comments you want to make.
When you talked about blockages, the one thing you didn't mention was inequality and the unequal distribution of power. The blockages aren't just about rhetoric, but they are also about the real inequalities of this world.
Yeah. Could you hear that, or should I repeat?
Again, it's sort of this buzzword bingo, and sometimes we will use the word inequality, sometimes we prefer inequity, sometimes we prefer inequivalence, sometimes it's all three. And yeah, within this room, we may accept that, but otherwise people might challenge the word. They might think it's just a buzzword. They might not fully accept it. But yeah, when we're talking about root causes, to throw out a few sort of more longer words, aside from inequality and inequity, marginalization, oppression, and to a large extent, and injustice. To a large extent, I hope we can just accept them intuitively, but we also have to be aware that particularly at the practical level, and particularly when translating to other languages, they don't always translate well. So no, I'm very happy you raised that. I'm very happy with talking about it. I deliberately did not throw out those words simply to try to keep it more baseline and simply conversational rather than sort of the buzzwords that we hear all the time.
Any other comments or questions?
On the question of climate disaster, you said that heat was likely one of the few measurable ones that we're dealing with today, which seems somewhat confused about the actual effects of climate change, especially when we discuss real people's lives. As you mentioned, we could only lose a few countries, which seems to be a much more serious problem than your flippant response. But more specifically, to avoid buzzwords, when we look at issues like the Arctic, where we're currently seeing villages like Shifshmaraf, which have no land rights outside their space, being destroyed by increasing waves and soil erosion, you might say that's just water, but it is in fact a climate-related disaster, while we're also seeing secession in the Arctic remove total access to wildlife that's necessary for the entirety of the population outside the road system. So what we're dealing with here is a wide number of issues. And while you might say, oh, the language of using climate covers this, what you're ignoring is that we've already seen these issues being tackled before as indigenous land rights or treaty obligations. And those are largely targeted as in the same way that you are targeting climate now. So rather than opposing a new political framing of a similar issue, you seem to be focusing on those that are trying to define an issue in a new way to get ahead of a political system that is established solely to maintain the destruction of these people.
There is no flippancy in one village or one country being ruined. We should not put words into other people's mouths. We should not morph what they are saying, because there is no humor and no desire for these people to suffer. It's not, excuse me, please let me finish. It's not just about Shishmaref. The General Accounting Office report of 2003 identified 14 villages in Alaska, which were in a similar situation, where they felt that through direct causation from human-caused climate change to rapid coastal erosion and flooding, they would probably have to move. But the solution is exactly as you pointed out. It's actually about land rights. It's actually about indigenous knowledge. If it weren't for what has been forced on these people, then they'd be able to adjust. They'd be able to deal with it. They'd have the resources. They'd have the support to continue exercising their hunting, to continue developing their livelihoods, to move where they want and to build where they want. But the sedentarization of the people, the locations which they choose, the current expectations and lifestyle are exactly what you're saying. We've undermined their culture and their traditions, and that is the root cause of not being able to deal with environmental changes. But yes, in those 14 villages, there's direct attribution from human-caused climate change through a sequence to what they are experiencing, and no one finds that flippant. No one wants that to happen, and it is a travesty that neither Alaska nor the US nor the world is giving the resources that they have demanded since 2003 to help themselves.
That still didn't answer my question. Why are you avoiding the use of climate as a new political framing for marginalized communities and largely anyone outside the established political framework in the global South and the global North to take charge? You targeted specifically groups trying to receive funding for the drowning of their islands, when for decades they've tried post-colonial efforts And you seem to have an issue with some sort of objective view of science when you're ignoring how science has been continuously used for the entire history of its application in the political space as a political tool. So I'm wondering, why is climate so specifically this obscuring, blocking, diverting issue, unlike any other political framing of the past 100, 200 years?
Because the way it's presented is not scientific and undermines solutions as per the evidence that I provided. This does not suggest that all these other framings will be any more successful. Exactly as you've stated, there are problems with it. But when if we're not going to sit here for 45 days discussing everything, then obviously we're going to deal with one issue. And the concern is when we have COP27, again, 27 COPs, when the headlines, we always see climate change blaming everything, then as a scientist, it is my obligation to pick a topic, to deal with it, and to challenge it. And if you want me to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism, I can do that. If you want me to talk about nuclear testing in the Pacific and how that destroyed a country, I can talk about that. If you want me to talk about how local cultures in the Pacific were undermined by bringing in spam and cigarettes, I can do that. If we want to look at external religions taking over indigenous cultures to the point that many indigenous peoples accept those external religions uncritically, I can talk about that. But I made a decision.
I have to leave that for another time, Ilan, because I would like to ask whether anybody else has another comment not related to this particular question.
No, but thank you. That's exactly the point. I can't go on and on and on and on because we want more questions.
We also have an online audience, and I would like to ask Matt, who's keeping an eye on the YouTube live comment stream, whether there's anything. No? Okay. Anyone in the room who has another issue you want to raise? No. Then maybe I'll chip in then, because I have one burning question, really. I was going to ask you, Ilan, about your talk. From talking to climate scientists about the issue, how politicians and science have interacted on the topic of climate change in the past decades, climate science has known for a very long time that the climate is warming, that this leads to a larger frequency and intensity of many natural disasters as a consequence of the impacts of climate change. And that our actions as humanity, by releasing greenhouse gas emissions and cutting down forests, we are directly contributing to the causes of these things. So there is a sense of frustration, I think, amongst climate scientists that there isn't more action being taken, and we are still on a pathway towards more like 2.8 degrees global warming rather than the 1.5 that is our political goal that has been agreed in the Paris Agreement. So the question is, to me, is it not sensible to talk about the climate crisis and the climate emergency like the UK Parliament has done? I mean, the UK Parliament has declared a climate emergency some years ago in order to move it up on the agenda in politics, because the politics is lagging behind, many decades behind the scientific insights into how climate functions and what the role of people on the planet is.
No, because this leads to exactly the problems in some of the phrases you used. As soon as we do that, and as soon as we only take climate scientists and not others, we start using the phrase you used, natural disaster. Whereas since the 70s, disaster researchers have been saying disasters aren't natural, do not use the phrase natural disaster. Similarly, the whole point of disaster research and political science and sociology and geography and many other disciplines, not climate science, is that the disaster arises from the people with the power, opportunities, and resources forcing vulnerability on others so they can't deal with weather or an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. So the statement that human-caused climate change, or even natural climate change, is increasing the frequency and intensity of disasters is not scientifically supportable. And this comes from fields far, far aside from climate scientists. Even when we look at hazards, human-caused climate change is increasing the intensity of hurricanes, but it's decreasing their frequency. And it's very complicated when we look at wildfires, when we look at landslides, when we even look at polar lows and metacanes, which are other types of cyclonic storms. It's complicated regarding parameterization, frequency, and intensity. But apart from exceptions like heat humidity, which absolutely human-caused climate change is causing huge mortality from heat humidity, there are not many disasters which are increasing in frequency and intensity due to human-caused climate change, and the disasters are not natural. So we need to not focus on sociologists or climate scientists. We need to bring everyone together to combine our knowledge in order to do better for wisdom.
Thank you for answering that question. I think we have run out of time. So let me then thank you for giving up your time today to talk to us about the climate terminology and the climate language that is being adopted. And thank you for the online audience and for people who are here in the seminar room for coming or for dialing into the talk today. So with that, I will draw the seminar to the close. If you're in the room here, we have refreshments at the back of the room if you want to stay for another discussion. And Ilan, I would just like to thank you for your time.
And thank you for the opportunity. And please do contact me, because we all make mistakes, we can all improve, and we have a long way to go to do better for ourselves and the planet. Thank you.